Wearing shardplate again after a long period without was like waking up after a night of feeling groggy and disoriented. The spring of the step, the impetus the armor seemed to lend him, made him want to race down the hallway. Welcome to The Storming Journey, a sacred text reading of The Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson. This podcast may contain spoilers for The Stormlight Archive through Wind and Truth. Hello, everyone. Welcome to The Storming Journey. I'm Liz, and I will be your Ardent today as we cover Chapter 26 of The Way of Kings.
I'm Elle, and I'm today's Worldsinger.
I'm Adam, and I'm today's Veristitalian.
So for my world singing today, I was thinking through some of the theme of discussing flow state, and I went to Wikipedia, which, I'm sorry, this sounds like the start of a really bad speech of, oh yes, I looked up the definition. But I was curious, and one of the phrases talked about, or one of the sections talked about how flow state isn't inherently good, especially if it becomes hyperfocus. It can be really bad. And I was like, oh yeah, I've experienced hyperfocus. I hate hyperfocus. But the thing that I think about more is less than flow state and hyperfocus, and more meditation, and how for me the best way to meditate is not by just sitting quietly with my legs crossed or kneeling and just sitting there with my thoughts. I find that really not meditative and not helpful. I've tried it so many times because everyone's like, this is the best way to meditate. But to me, I find that it's more meditative to be doing something repetitive like crocheting or cross-stitching or even just walking than it is to sit silently. So that's my world thing for today. If regular meditation isn't working for you, try something a little bit different, and that might be more helpful.
And to flow right into the storm's eye view, Dalinar listens to a reading from the Way of Kings, pondering on Adolin's harsh words about his dreams. Horns sound, signaling a chasm fiend sighting. Dalinar calls his men to march, but Sadeas interrupts, seeking to investigate the broken strap of the king's saddle. Sadeas joins the march, questioning Dalinar's loyal men and needling Dalinar himself. Dalinar flows into battle, the thrill exciting every swing of blade. They win. Adolin obtains the gem heart, and Dalinar sights a shard bearer Proshendi, watching in the distance.
Okay, and if you haven't gathered by now, the theme that we're looking at this chapter through is flow. I think flow state is such an interesting thing to think about. It's gone through many different names over the centuries. I think meditation is definitely a type of flow state, or I just think there have been different words, but this is kind of the word we use for it nowadays, is flow. And I was interested in the different things that Dalinar experiences that cause him to go into kind of this meditative, enthralled state in this chapter. So the chapter starts with him listening to the Way of Kings and, just kind of getting absorbed in it. When the lady who's reading to him finishes, there's just a quiet and stillness that feels the same as when you're meditating, right? And you're listening to, maybe somebody's guiding you, and then it just kind of stops and it continues on in silence. And then, of course, the thrill is also a different kind of flow state, maybe not as positive of a one. So what did you guys observe reading this chapter through flow state? What do we observe from Dalinar that could teach us about how we get into a flow state, how it's helpful, how it's maybe dangerous?
I kind of felt like Dalinar wasn't actually in a flow state for a lot of this. Especially in contrast to a couple of chapters from now, where he's breaking up rock to build the latrine. It feels very distinct of, I'm in a flow state, I'm using this repetitive action to let my body move while I'm thinking. And it felt like more of a contrast to the things that he was like trying to use to induce a flow state. So it was almost like he knew he needed that time to think, but everything that he normally used to do that wasn't working for him in this chapter. So like the Way of Kings did kind of help him, but it didn't give him enough of the guidance he wanted or enough of the flow state for long enough. Or like putting on the armor also wasn't like a long enough time. And then the thrill like had a deliberate break in it where he like completely disconnected from it. So I don't know. I just thought that was like interesting of like, to me, I saw it more as he is trying to get into a flow state, but he finds it difficult. And it's not until 2 chapters from now where it seems like he does find that flow state.
I definitely agree a little bit with there's no like seemingly connected flow throughout the chapter, but I think those points of rupture from flow are really important. Right, because he does get into a flow state. When you're listening to a reading, he's in the moment with the parable. He's in the moment with the story. When he's in the thrill, he's still in it for a little bit, even if it's not like the 3 pages that he's in it for the chapter 2 chapters later. There are still those moments of flow. So I was kind of connecting with and looking at those things that kick him out of flow. So like he's getting into the flow of going to the war, and then Sadeas shows up and that like knocks him out of the flow, or he ends the reading and that knocks him out of the flow, or things like that. So I was also paying attention to those moments of rupture, of impeded or damned like flow, damned being in the like stopped formation of it. And the other 2 points that I was really pulling on when flow was thinking about the off-page flow. So for the Adolin's idea of flow and how he needed to get into a flow state to come back to his father in a very kind of like repentant way, right? And we don't get to see that, but I think we can assume that Adolin had to go through a little like hyperfixation flow on like, what did I do with my father? Why did I make him so angry? I still want to stick to what I said, but I didn't. So there was that flow off the page that I was noticing. And then also the Parshindi's flow in War, when they fight together with song, and how that gets them into a flow and a connection to Roshar, and also a connection to each other and to the battle itself. And so that's where like some of the moments beyond Dalinar that I was seeing. But I think like with Dalinar, I mainly was focusing on like how there's a tension of like he's getting into flow and then there's a stop. He's getting into flow and there's a stop. He's getting into flow and there's a stop, which is interesting to compare that to that title of stillness, right? Where stillness you would think would be an end of a flow state, but he never reaches that. I think he's always stopped from ending the completion of like a flow cycle.
I think it's really interesting that you pointed out the difference, the way the Parshendi are also in a flow state as they're singing and battling together, and they're in harmony with Roshar, and comparing that to the thrill, which is also kind of a flow state, but it's a much less we're connected with the world around us flow state versus a obsessive destructive flow state. It's more of the flow state of someone who's addicted to something and is getting their fix and like getting as much as they possibly can and continuing to go in that destructive cycle. Those are two, they're very interesting contrasts here. What can we learn from that contrast?
I just was thinking about how like even though there's a contrast there, they're still both states connected to Roshar, right? The thrill is connected to Odium, and the Parshindi's like singing is connected to the planet Roshar because they're native to the planet, right? And I think then somewhat to honor in Odium as well, right? And like if the shard is invested in the planet, I think we could go as far to say that it is a part of the planet, even though like the planet existed before the shard got here, so it's not an indigenous part of the planet, but it's like a thing that has become a part of the planet. And so I think it's interesting that those 2 types of flows are different. And I love that pointing out, because I wouldn't have thought of that, of the thrill being just so destructive in relation to the Parshindis not being as destructive. But like both of them are connected to Roshar and to like that core central aspect of this planet, which is very, I mean, it has to be alien to us, right? Because it's like the flow of our earth when it comes to all of our mythologies is always like niceness, motherhood, things like that, right? And Roshar is very much like war, battle, destruction, and things like that.
I'm just wondering, like, if we have examples of these two kinds of flow states in our lives? Like, can we differentiate between the two? Because like maybe the thrill is the kind of flow state that maybe you get into when you're scrolling on your phone, right? It's the doom scrolling kind of flow state where like you can just sit in the same thing forever and not realize that hours have gone by, but it's doing something destructive to you spiritually and internally. Whereas the Parshendi's flow state is more of a like a connection and a productive flow state where you feel good afterwards because you're, you know, cooperating with someone to accomplish something rather than feeling drained and kind of disgusting afterwards.
I don't know if it's specifically like a contrast between like the destructive versus the positive, but I was on a higher dose of an ADHD medication that like when I was on it, it felt like my brain would not stop. Like it felt like the car was going too fast. It wasn't that it was going out of control. It was just like I'm going 80 down a really straight highway and there's no way I can get off and no way I can stop until I run out of gas. And so I had to like go down on my dosage because I was like, I can't do that. Yes, I'm being productive, but it means I'm not stopping. I can't be interrupted. I can't stop to eat anything. Like I don't remember to take care of myself because I'm just like going on this path. And so for me, like the hyper focus that I get into with ADHD can be really like, it feels like the thrill in the sense of this is destructive because I don't feel like I can control it. Like I feel a little bit out of control. I can't stop obsessing over what I'm doing. Like today, I was supposed to be prepping for the podcast. I was like, oh, I still need to do my summary or whatever. And instead, I spent like 4 hours doing a thing that was way overcomplicated for Procopia because I thought it would be fun. And it was, but like I had things I needed to get done and I could not like break that hyper focus to do the things I needed to do. Which is why I do like ADHD meds, but sometimes they don't completely help. They just make it different.
I can somewhat relate to that this week. I got the idea at the beginning of the week to move my office downstairs and put my bed up in my loft in my apartment because my office was up in the loft. So it was like this place where I would ascend to go work, right? And then I could leave my work up there. And I got this idea to move it into my office because I was like, I don't like walking upstairs to go to work. And like I get home very late. Like I get home from classes at 10 p.m. and I usually would just like drop my bag and go to bed instantly after walking the dog rather than like going upstairs and taking a moment to like write up some notes from class or something like that. And I got really focused on needing to move the office this week. And I couldn't do any work up in my office until I had moved it. So like Wednesday night, I had a friend come over and we just like moved everything. And that ruined my Thursday because I was so tired that day. And I had all these readings to do for class and I had all this grading to do still. And it wasn't until this morning, the Saturday morning, when like I finally got all the books put away and the office all figured out. And now it's like, oh, I can work again because I did that thing, because I got that flow state I overcome that flow state. And this is like I would call this a mixed flow state, right? Like it was bad because I couldn't do anything in the office until I had it moved. But also in moving it, now I feel a lot more comfortable because now I'm surrounded by all my books. As you can tell, there's a lot of books here if you're watching. There's also books on the other side. There's like 5 bookshelves across the way on the other side of the room. But like it was that sense of like, I knew the thing that was going to come from it was going to be really good because now I have a space where I can actually close the door and like really remove it. And during the summer, I'm going to really need that when I don't have anything to like cut me off from doing work. But at the same time, in order to do this, I had to put off work as well. So now my tomorrow has 100 to-do list items on it to be ready for Monday. And I think like that's kind of like a mixture of the two where it's like a negative thing because I had to put everything off to do it, but also a positive thing because at the end of the day, I now feel a lot more better and I can get into even better research flow states.
That's kind of reminding me of what happens to Dalinar after the reading of Way of Kings at the beginning of the chapter, right? His scribe finishes reading the passage to him. Dalinar does not read the passage. himself. But he says listening to that sequence had become one of Dalinar's favorites. Listening to it had often comforted him. Someone else had known, understood how he felt, but today it didn't work. So he's trying to get into that flow state. He's trying to, get into like leadership mode. And it's not working for him because something is bothering him. And it's what Adolin said to him. And it's interrupting his ability to like bring himself into this state that he wants to be in of developing himself into an honorable leader. He's got this nagging thing in the back of his mind that like Adolin thinks I'm doing the wrong thing and I'm worried about that. And so he cannot use his same things to get into the state he wants to get into.
I also think it's interesting that moment that Renarin's there, and Renarin's also someone that becomes a speed bump to his flow state because of the moment when Renarin gives no reply, and that's like Renarin's like response usually is this. So it's exactly, and Renarin had a habit of doing that, being like the room falling silent, felling conversations like an enemy archer hunting officers on the battlefield, and then like that kind of like also engages the broader like relationships that are stopping his flow state in this chapter, right? The speed bumps on the way into that, where are like the things that he's most connected to, the things that he has the greatest connection, big C to, but also the greatest relationships with. Because I think they all remind him of all the things that he's not, right? And it's interesting because like a flow state is something that like when you get into it, you cut out everything around you. You limit the relationships. Like the 4 hours on Pocopia, you're probably not talking to your child or your spouse during those 4 hours. And so like a flow state, while being sometimes really good, like I think about research flow states that I've gotten into where I've like finally figured out a thing in an article that I'm writing or in a historical issue that I'm dealing with. And I get into that flow state and I've done the 6 hours of work and I like come out of it going, oh, this is great. But then it's like I have 20 text messages or something, which I never do because I don't get a lot of text messages. But like, that general sense of like a flow state can't quite be there with relationships.
I really like that insight because like we almost always think about like flow state generally implies a positive, whereas like something like hyperfocus implies a negative. But a lot of times when flow state is a thing people want to achieve. Like that's a thing that like writers are like, how do I get into a flow state so that I can just write and not focus on other things? And for as much as we talk about like the importance of connection, this is also a time where like it's important to disconnect from people. Like I need to be able to not be talking to my coworkers at work in order to get into enough of a flow state to find the things I need to find or do my job the way I need to do it. And it's easier to focus when you don't have the distractions of those connections. I can see how constantly being in a flow state would be bad, but it almost feels like that means then that the time that you're not in that flow state or not trying to get into that flow state should be spent more deliberately trying to make connections of like recognizing, okay, I spent 6 hours doing X, which means I need to spend like 20 minutes or an hour reconnecting with people. And as much like for me, I often think about, okay, I was in a flow state. I need to take some time to not doing anything by myself. But I think maybe like one of the things to think about in conjunction with that is you also need time to reestablish connection with other people as part of the coming back from a flow state.
Makes me think of like one of the reasons why we have like outside of home work where you go to work for 8 hours and you deal with your family after before that, right? Is like you have to be separated from those closest relationships in order to actually get work done, which is like one of the reasons why during the pandemic it was so hard to work from home because you couldn't get into that flow state. You had your child asking you for strawberries. You had your spouse needing something, or you needing to go get groceries or things like that, right? And all these other things where if you go off to work for 8 hours, those things they pull on you, but you can draw a line, right? There's like an actual demarcation against them, which allows you to then go out and do the work, which I don't know if that's positive at the same time, because it's like we also have all these struggles of like people who like stereotypical, like man goes off to work. I'm thinking like 1950s working in the ad agency or something. The man goes off to the ad agency, but doesn't know how to deal with the family when he gets home, but he knows how to deal with the people in the boardroom because he's been there for so long, because he's understood it, because he knows how to do it, but then goes home to the family and like yells with the wife or doesn't know how to care with the children. I almost wonder, like, is there a way to create flow, get the productivity of flow while still having relationships come in and out of that? Or is there just a kind of like a unified thing of like flow needs to be disconnected from relationships? Like Dalinar needs to shut everything out, as he does 2 chapters later, right? Where he just like just puts his visor on and says, I'm not going to focus on anything but building this random latrine. And it's like, those are needed sometimes, but is there a way to get that same result through a relationship or through that connection?
Well, I think for me, I ended up needing to work from home 1 day a week for my internship because I felt like I could never get into the flow at work. Like, because of where my office was, because of how offices work at my workplace, there was never a way for me to like have a solid amount of time. But I also recognize that like being in the office has a level of importance. And so for me, it was, okay, I'm going to work in the office for 8 hours a week. And then the remaining 2 days, I break up my time and I spend in the office, and I don't feel bad about the time that I spend chatting more with a coworker about a project or whatever, because I'm building those relationships and I'm building those connections, because that's not the time for my flow state. My flow state is my at-home work, where I can get into a flow state in a different way. And I think like traditional jobs are really hard to do that. My husband works from home and he's found it easier, I think, to have moments of flow while also having moments of connection, because he's at home and so he can come down and connect with me on his lunch break. Whereas if he's in an office, that's a lot harder. But he could set aside, hey, I'm going to close my office door. Don't interrupt me for 4 hours while I work on this project or whatever. So I think it's possible. I just don't think it's like, it's something that the modern workplace like thinks about or necessarily even cares about to the same degree. It feels like productivity is more of the goal than like connections with other people.
I think somewhat like we have to design our own way around that, right? If our office is not taking that into account, we have to take that into account ourselves and say, okay, how do I get myself out of work mode and back into family mode when I come home? My husband does a great job, just like Els. He works from home and he's really good at like switching on and switching off. I am not. I work from home 3 days a week and I'm supposed to be doing research and writing. And a lot of the time I end up not doing that and doing stuff around the house and puttering around and doing things that don't really need to be done. But like, it's hard for me to get into a flow state when I'm at home because I'm still so anchored to those things. And one thing that's helped me, which I think we also see with Dalinar in this chapter, is having some sort of ritual of transition. So I like making a nice cup of herbal tea or a hot chocolate to like bring with me and be like, okay, I'm in work mode now because I have this. And we kind of see that with Dalinar as he's putting on his armor, right? With the cold open quote. Once he puts on the armor, he's into a different state than he was before. And it changes how he feels. And part of that is the magic, right? But I think rituals are somewhat magic, right? And we respond well to them, even if they don't have any actual significance. There's nothing about having a glass of hot chocolate that helps me actually work, except for it's tricking my brain. And so Dalinar is able to like move into the state of being a warrior by putting on this armor, and it changes his mindset.
It's also like the necessity there, right? Like the process itself is very key, because if you forget a part of the shard plate, it probably won't get all connected and all magic-y, yeah, but like also just in the general sense of like people going to war also have to prep their armor, also have to do everything, or else a stray arrow is going to strike them, right? And so like I like that thinking of ritual as being the entrance into that sacred space. So here thinking through like Eliad's idea of sacred and profane and sacred time, where it's like the religion has a sacred time that is up here separate from the profane time. And those times are not chronologically connected, but something has to connect you between the two and has to bring you into that. And that's the ritual, as you were saying. And I think like connecting that to the armor, connecting it to the story, like he tried with the story, he tried with Way of Kings to get into that state. It didn't work. He tried with the armor. He got into a state, but it didn't solve his problem because like he can't solve it by going to war. I think it solved something, right? Because he talks a lot. There's so much talk about him and Adolin needing the fight, needing this one gem heart, needing this one thing. And like that moving through those steps to get there almost gets him into a flow state, but it's a flow state that's then kind of like ignored and forgotten because like none of those answer his thing. So it's like it's also you have to be in the right flow place to get the answers that you need, right? And to do the thing that you want at the end. So like with your hot chocolate, you have to be at the desk itself with the hot chocolate. You can't just be walking around your house with a hot chocolate picking up after your kids, right? And so I think that's interesting too, the connection of place with that ritual.
So I have the ADHD anti-planner, which is like you don't use it every day. You use it when you are feeling a certain way. And so there's different sections for like disorganized or whatever. But it has different tricks for like, how do you get into a flow or different work ideas? And so there are things like, okay, here's a sweatshirt that you only ever use when you're trying to focus on work. Here's a specific candle that you light. Here's a specific drink that you make when you are going into your flow mode. And so like, I think that's interesting to think about that, like, those are actually really helpful tips to try to get into a flow state. But you also have to know what works. You are willing to try new things, but you have to know what works. And that's why Dalinar is in this book trying all the things that have worked for him before. Like he's going off to battle for the first time in like ages. I think because he thinks, well, it's been helpful to be in a flow state with the thrill before. So maybe that will work again for me to make these processes. And he does try all the things that have worked. And it isn't until he kind of almost tries something new, some hard labor in 2 chapters from now, that he is able to get into that. So I just think it's interesting to think about the things that work for us and try those, but like be willing to try something new to get us into it as well.
I think what's interesting is he does get an answer in the thrill right before the end of the battle. So before the section break to they won the battle, he hears that life before death, right? What was that voice? So he gets an answer to his problem. The answer he doesn't follow at the end of the day, right? He chooses death rather than life by deciding to abdicate the throne, or not the throne, abdicate his high princedom. Yeah. Yeah. But like he gets an answer in that flow state. He gets an answer in the thrill state of life before death. And he doesn't know what the voice is. Maybe it's a Stormfather. Maybe it's just a random voice. I don't think we're ever told. But I do think he does get an answer, right? But it's an answer he doesn't recognize. It's an answer he's not used to that as being the conclusion to a flow state. The conclusion of the flow state is I have the answer to my specific question. Whereas this is not the answer he understands, because life before death is not just an answer. It's also a methodology. It's also an approach that you have to follow.
Okay, I want us to move on to our sacred reading method today, which, because we've got a reading from the Way of Kings, I feel like we have to do a parable reading of it again, because that's how Dalinar is often reading these. I wanted to do a little bit more traditional approach to parables this time. Often when we're teaching children and youth about how to read a parable, we'll make kind of a chart of, okay, here are all the different elements in this story, and what do they line up with symbolically? So I'm going to read the story from the beginning of the chapter, and it gives us one of them afterwards, one of the symbols, what it means. But I want to kind of think a little deeper about what each of the things in this story could symbolize if we're going to have a spiritual interpretation of this story. So we can make a list of the elements we notice as we read and then talk about what they might symbolize. So I'll skip over the connecting matter here and just read the story straight. I stood in the darkened monastery chamber, its far reaches painted with pools of black where light did not wander. I sat on the floor, thinking of that dark, that unseen. I could not know for certain what was hidden in that night. I suspected there were walls, sturdy and thick, but could I know without seeing? When all was hidden, what could a man rely upon as true? Candle flames. A dozen candles burned themselves to death on the shelf before me. Each of my breaths made them tremble. To them I was a behemoth, to frighten and destroy. And yet if I strayed too close, they could destroy me. My invisible breath, the pulses of life that flowed in and out, could end them freely, while my fingers could not do the same without being repaid in pain. I understood in a moment of stillness, those candle flames were like the lives of men, so fragile, so deadly. Left alone, they lit and warmed. Let run rampant, they would destroy the very things they were meant to illuminate. We'll stop there. Okay, so I think we have a couple of elements here. We have Noadon's interpretation that the candle flames are like the lives of men. Let's build out some of the other elements that we've got here. So the beginning of the parable starts with being in a dark chamber and not being able to see or know for sure if there are walls around you. So any thoughts about interpreting this? If the candles that are illuminating the darkness are our lives, what's this? What's the darkness?
I think the darkness is like almost the universe itself, or like time. It sounds really abstract, but I'm just kind of thinking of it as like, we don't really know what the future holds. To some extent, we don't completely know what the past held, because we kind of really only know interpretations of the past that someone else has provided us. And even our own past, our memories are complex and fallible. And we also can't completely know everything that's going on where we currently are, or like in the present, because we're not omniscient. So like it can feel overwhelming to not know all of the things. I am someone who wants to know all of the things. Like, I just like knowing things. And so to me, like, not knowing things feels overwhelming and like darkness.
I think in other religious traditions, they would call it the mysteries, like the mysteries of God. If you're wanting to put a more lighter shine on the darkness part, or on the unknown, right? Like that is a mystery of God, and so like we can't know it, but it's just something that works out. Which I don't think in Mormonism we quite fall into those mysteries, because most things are known in Mormonism, quote unquote, or almost known, right? Or there's a sense of hubris and pride almost with it, with that sense of knowledge. Whereas I think a lot of other religions sit with mystery a little bit better than Latter-day Saints do.
I think the Latter-day Saint approach tends to be like, even if we don't know it now, we will be able to figure it out eventually. The like Mormonism is about like all of the finding and gathering all of the truth, is a Joseph Smith quote I love. And so I think you're right though, that like we tend to not be okay with sitting with the mystery. I mean, I think I end up being in the, yeah, it's a mystery, but like I know it's not going to be a mystery forever. So like I'm not going to sit with the mystery of it, because I'll eventually know.
It's something I'm envious whenever I read the early church fathers of, when they're like, oh, it's just a mystery, and we like that it's a mystery. I had a different reading of the darkness, though. I was thinking of it, if the flame is the lives of men, the darkness is like the death of men, or like the beyond death of men, to like juxtapose the idea of light and death itself within the parable. Because in reading it, when I was reading it for the review of this podcast, I was thinking, I'm like, you have this first chunk of it where it's like, I suspected there were walls, but could I know without seeing when all was hidden? And then it instantly goes, there's candle flames there. And I'm like, we were just told it was completely dark in this parable. We were told it was like, you can't see beyond that. So like you're imagining it, like if you're spatially thinking about it, it's a room, and the person's in the center of the room, and the candles are all around the person flickering, but at the edges there, it's the darkness. So I think for me, if we agree with Noadon, which I don't think we need to agree with Noadon, that the light, the candles are the lives of men. Like we can do other readings of it, but if that's the lives of men, the darkness has to be like the opposite of the life of man, which the opposite of the life of man would be like an unalive part, a death part, a unexisting or less vibrant part of life.
I think we also have to pull in kind of Plato's allegory of the cave a little bit, because we know Sanderson likes Plato. If you've ever read the Alcatraz series, this is why all of my kids know about Plato's allegory of the cave, is because there's a long explication of it in the Alcatraz books. But it feels very similar in situation, right? There are shadows, there are like cave-like walls, and there's lights. And so I do feel like it's something there about like the existence of the walls is like what's real and what's true in reality, and darkness is keeping us from that somehow. So maybe it is something like the unknown, which is kind of the same vibe you're both getting at. And then the lives of men are illuminating the unknown, which is interesting. So like the way we learn about stuff is not just through our own observation, but through other people's observations as well. Like we're all one of these lights helping to contribute to pushing back the darkness a little bit to see what's really there.
There's also then like a sense of truth, right? Because it's always going to be a dark, sturdy wall. It's always going to be whatever is in the darkness. It's just not until we see it, right? Until that sense of capital T truth, or he does capital T true in the text, right? But like that sense of like, it's going to be a rock wall there, even if you can't see it, because the life of man has not experienced it yet.
Can I posit something possibly unhinged, that we don't actually have the text between the what could a man rely upon as true and candle flames? That like she could have been reading. Like, I think there is enough textual evidence to suggest that there is a possibility that she continued reading, and we don't actually have that text in the middle there. So the reason I'm pausing this is because I'm thinking, okay, he's in a completely dark room, and then there's candle flames. And he spends the first half, like Adam was saying, being like, well, how can I know? It's dark. We don't know enough about the walls. And then there's candle flames. So what if something like he's feeling around for things and finds candles, finds a match, is able to light them, and then he's like, oh, these candle flames are here now. And now I can see more. And like, does that active part of this, him actively lighting the flames, does that change how we would read either the candle flames themselves or the darkness?
That's really interesting, because the next element of the parable is this contemplation of like the relationship between a human being and a candle, that like he could easily blow the candles out, which is another death metaphor here. But they could also, destroy him, right, by lighting him on fire or whatever. Which is kind of saying like there's this dangerous tension between us and other people always. Like we can hurt them, even accidentally, right? He says like each of his breaths made them tremble. So like he could even just accidentally breathe out one of the candles, not on purpose. But he could also on purpose, violently put one out with his fingers, right? To reach out and just put it out. But if we posit that he also lit the candles, then it brings to mind like a family type of metaphor. Like, do we light other people? Do we help other people come into existence? Even if you're not like necessarily having children, maybe like you're kindling a flame in someone by teaching them, by mentoring them. We're bringing other people into the light.
I think as well beyond that, we could pull it to like a classroom with teaching. We could pull that to also just like discovery and reading, like as you read what other people have written, as you light their candles, right? You're doing different things. And as you like decide what to take into you, you're either blowing out that candle or snuffing that candle out or keeping it lit, right? Even as the knowledge itself kind of like waxes or wanes away from you, I guess. Doesn't wax because wax is growing, but
waxes and wanes?
Yeah. My comfort reading at night right now is the Alloy of Law. And so maybe it's on the brain. But I like that that expands it beyond the sense of the political philosophy that he really dives down in the later part of the chapter, right? Where he's like, Dalinar's like, it's the best political philosophy of the entire world. The Way of Kings is my Bible. Um, and I like this expansion from it, where it's not just about, you know, the politics of a leader. It's the politics of a family itself. It's the politics of a group of people. It's a politics of like knowledge, fonts of knowledge that you've gathered around yourself, or it's the politics of like a collected anthology work, and things like that.
I think that's like important to, when we're thinking about it this way, highlighting like what parts are lit and what parts aren't lit. If we have a whole cluster of candles that's around like one particular corner and no candles in this other corner, then we don't understand what's in that other corner, and we maybe over understand, or like we have enough light shining on this part of the corner. I like thinking about it in terms of not lives, but in terms of their ideas, their capacity to like share things with other people, to connect with other people. I think maybe to like bring that back to like the flow state idea of like, you needs other people to like help get you started to some extent. Like, I find it sometimes what helps me get into a flow state is somebody else's like insight on something I'm working on, where I have to have that moment where I go talk to somebody else because I've hit a break in my flow state of like, okay, I can't think of anything that would make this different. And then I go talk to someone else and say, hey, I'm working through this thing. This is what I've been doing. And then they give me what ends up being a clue to starting another flow state. And so like those breaks in flow states are really important for community building to help you continue those almost.
I think that's one of the sorrows of this parable, or like, because I always find a parable, like they're always meant to teach one thing. You can always gather multiple things from them, but I always think there's a tragedy underneath every parable. And I think the tragedy here is that the person who has lit the flame, or the person who is next to the flame, never sees himself as a flame, or herself as a flame, or themselves as a flame, right? Because it says, to them, I was a behemoth. And it's like others, the candles, right? The candles are not the person who has lit them. And so the main character of this parable is always something different than everyone else around the narrator. And I think that's the tragedy of the parable, right? Is that the narrator can't see that the narrator could also be a candle. I think that's a tragedy of a leader, right? When the leader doesn't see themselves as a part of the people, when they see themselves as separate, which is what they could destroy me, or I could destroy them. That tension keeps a very long chasm between you and the people that you're serving, you and the people that you're around. And I think that's one of the tragedies of this parable.
But we could also read that as it's much easier to see and learn from someone else's experience. You can often get a bigger picture of that reading, you know, a work by someone that's kind of encapsulated their thought, whereas sometimes that can be harder to do for yourself because you are inside that experience. And so there's a qualitative difference between learning from someone else's life and perspective and trying to learn from your own. So it kind of makes sense that the observer and the observed are different here.
But there's still just that sad thing where he's like, I could kill all these candles just by a breath. And it's like, King dude, you are a candle as well. Like, you should be a candle in your sense. And I understand your reading. I definitely agree with it. But I think there is that tension there.
Definitely agree. I think it's now time to move on to our Wisdom of the Herald segment, where we each talk about what we want to bring from this reading back into our daily lives.
I think for me, I want to focus more on the relationship building outside of my flow states, because I like my flow states. They're pretty good. Whenever I think the one thing we didn't talk about this episode was, you guys know the work of like Cal Newport and deep work. I always think about that when it comes around to flow state and working and, you know, really focusing on things like that. But I think I focused a lot on that in my life, and I haven't focused on the when you come home and the building of the relationships there that are opposite, or not opposite, but are not as connected and as intimately to like your works thing. And so I think for me, I've had a call to maybe focus on those relationships outside my flow state.
For me, watching how Dalinar's attempt at a flow state is interrupted by, the nagging thought of what Adolin has told him makes me think about, I've been struggling to get into a writing state lately, and I think something that could help is if I take time away from like trying to do productive writing and do some journaling about, what is bothering me, what's keeping me from getting into this flow state, and try to deal with that stuff instead of just trying to push through that stuff and get to the flow state.
Maybe you can go build a latrine in your backyard.
Goodness knows that my yard could use some weeding.
I think for me, this episode has reinforced the importance of routine to some degree. I am so bad at keeping routines, but I need them so much. I'm pretty sure I've done this as a Wisdom of the Heralds before, but my life is changing again with the end of my internship. And I think I want to remember the things that we've talked about in this episode, especially like the importance of flow state and how to get into that, but also the importance of what we do when we leave that flow state. And I want to keep those in mind as I try to build out a new routine for me in the next 6 months or however long that is.
Thank you for joining us today on The Storming Journey. You can support our work on this podcast by subscribing to our Patreon, leaving a review, or sharing the podcast with a friend. We hope you'll join us next week, and in the meantime, remember, journey before destination.